Hertford's rivers. The title slide there shows the major rivers of Hertford, and the blue ones are some of the bigger of the relatively minor rivers of Hertford. So there may be more there than most people realise, but Hertford is certainly sat on a confluence of a number of rivers. So what I intend to talk about tonight, well, obviously who I am, quick talk through how I got into managing rivers, because it's not the sort of job that you normally think about applying for. A bit about the semantics and legalities of rivers, things that usually trip people up. Run through and describe the job that I did with some pertinent details, and then really spend the rest of the time talking about the nature of the rivers in Hertford, the issues around managing them, and some of the implications for Hertford of being sat on so many rivers, and then summarise the talk. So I joined what was then the National Rivers Authority in 1991, following the impact of BSE, mad cow disease, on our farm. Our profitability dropped substantially in 1989, and by 1991 we definitely needed to do something different. So I started applying for jobs and happened to see an advert in the local Mercury for a flood defence inspector for the National Rivers Authority. And I probably thought the same as the rest of you on those. Applied for the job and found myself called for interview after quite a significant wait, and was successful in getting the job. Essentially, I was employed to look after this patch up here. The coloured areas on this map represents what was then referred to as Thames region of the National Rivers Authority, northeast area. So the Thames obviously starts right up in the Cotswolds, and was split into Upper Thames, northeast Thames, and southeast Thames. Within the northeast area, it was actually split into 4 sub areas for management by the local inspectors, and it was this north patch that I was taken on to manage. So I found myself looking after somewhere about 650 miles of watercourse, ranging from very small channels right up to the River Lee itself and the other major rivers of that catchment. The job was I'll leave it there. The job was essentially to program the maintenance works for each year, to apply for the funding for the works, to then liaise with the general public and with landowners, to deal with complaints that came in from the general public about rivers, to walk rivers and issue the maintenance works, to identify what work needed doing and to issue the works, which were then generally done by our own workforce, and then to go back and check that they were done adequately, sign it off, report on it. And that was the vast bulk of the work. But a fundamental part of it also was that for over 20 years, I acted as an out-of-hours emergency flood response controller for one half of that previous map area, the North District and East London. So I would be on duty for 7 days at a time, 7 days on and 7 days off. Did that for 20 odd years. And whenever there was heavy rainfall, everyone else would retire home, tuck themselves up, and I'd be putting on wet weather gear and going out to actually see what was happening in the field and to direct emergency response. There's a number of questions that people always ask about the area. The first of which is, should it be LEE or LEA? And as you can see from this excerpt from the OS map, both of them are actually considered correct. The Environment Agency use LEE, but Lee Valley Parks use LEA. So you pay your money and take your choice. There is no correct answer to that. So what's a river? What's a watercourse? Essentially, anywhere that water is constrained into a channel and flows, it is a watercourse. As for what's a river and what's a stream or a brook, or they're all different descriptions for watercourses. Where it actually matters is in legal terms, and legally a watercourse is either defined as a main river or an ordinary watercourse, or potentially a public sewer, and there's a final category, an award drain as well. It sounds like it's just semantics, but it does make a difference as to who manages them. And I was responsible just for main river. This is the official map of main river for southern England, and in a classic piece of British law, if it's marked on this map held by DEFRA, then it's main river. It doesn't in any way relate to the size of it or the importance of it. It's whether it's on that map or not. And each year there is a process whereby the map is checked, and the Environment Agency and local authorities are able to petition to have something either added to the map or taken away. And the significance of that is that if it's main river, then the overall duty of supervision of it falls to the Environment Agency. If it's not main river, if it's ordinary watercourse, which is the alternative definition, then it falls to the local authority. Some of them are pretty clear cut. The Lee itself, for example, is a major channel conveying flow through Hertfordshire, and it would be unconscionable for that not to be main river. But some of the small ones do actually change occasionally. And during my time, we went through a process of enmaining what were previously ordinary watercourses, and we took over the maintenance of them in the Hertford area from East Herts District Council. The powers to maintain watercourses depend on who's actually doing it, but the Environment Agency's powers originally come from the Water Resources Act 1991, and they're quite wide-ranging powers. But interestingly, the Environment Agency only have two duties under that act. One is to operate a flood warning system, and the other is to have an overall duty of supervision of all main river. And to my knowledge, that's never actually been tested in court to determine what qualifies as suitable supervision of main river watercourses. Beyond that, all of the works that they do are actually discretionary. They have powers to do works, but they don't have any obligation to exercise them. And that's become very important over the last few decades, as maintenance budgets have been cut and maintenance has been withdrawn from quite large areas. In law, the principal responsibility to maintain a watercourse actually rests with the landowner through which the watercourse runs. And contrary to an awful lot of people's understanding, the Environment Agency itself owns very little river. In fact, in this area, the only one I can think of is, apart from a few individual structures on rivers, is the section of the bed of the Lee navigation, just downstream, just to the southeast of Ware, between Hardmead Lock and Stansted Lock. And the predecessor to the Environment Agency actually bought that section of river some years ago when they enlarged it to improve the flood conveyance capacity of it. So they definitely own that one. But through Hertford, there is no river owned by the Environment Agency. I've just been through duties and powers. Anyone who owns a piece of land with a watercourse running through it is referred to as a riparian owner. And that comes with rights and responsibilities. Interestingly, if you own a piece of land with a watercourse running through it, then one of the rights that you do have is to take water for private use from that watercourse up to a maximum quantity of 20 cubic meters a day, which is about 4,000 gallons a day, without having to apply for a license for it. And if there's only 20,000 gallons a day coming down the river, then you can take it. You can drain that river, and in law, no one can stop you. I described earlier that this essentially was the essence of my job. So moving onto Hertford's rivers, let's see if I can bring a pointer up. I think most of you probably are already aware of the major channels. The Lee coming down, coming in through Horns Mill, down onto Castlemead, originally starts in North Luton, and the majority of the flood flows coming down that channel actually start as a peak generated by the urban area of Luton. It's interesting, we had a very prolonged period of dry weather in the late 90s, which led to some of the local rivers starting to dry up. And at the height of that in 1999, the Environment Agency's gauging station, which is just off this screen at the moment, upstream of Hertford at the old Waterhall Quarry, I'm reliably informed that over 90% of the flow at that point during that drought was actually the outfall from East Hyde sewage works at Luton. So only 10% of what was going through Hertford was water that hadn't been through a sewage works. Moving round, we've got the MIEnvSc coming in, rises up at Whitwell and works its way down through Old Welwyn to join the Lee at the back of Hertford Football Club. The Bean, which rises up near Sandon at Buntingford and works its way down through Walken and Watton at Stone. The Rib rising just to the back of the Silver Ball Cafe up at Buckland, north of Buntingford, between Buntingford and Royston on the Reach, comes down through Buntingford, Standon, Barrackford, and down into Hertford. And then they all join together and form the Lee navigation heading down towards Ware. We have a few smaller watercourses joining them in Hertford, so Brickenden Brook, main river, down to the south, and Bayford Brook. The Gulfs, this is one of the ones that was part of it was enmained in that process when we took watercourses over from East Herts Council. So prior to that, the Environment Agency responsibility only started at the end of Mead Lane, just here, into a channel known as the Manifold Ditch that rejoins the Lee at Ware Lock. And as part of that project, we took over the Gulfs through the town and up to just at the top of Valley Close on the south side of the town. We also took over parts of Froxholes Brook. It may surprise some people to realise that there are that many watercourses in Hertford, and some of them are quite well hidden, the Gulfs being a classic one. It runs into Culvert not far from the back of All Saints Church. The line of the map here is actually slightly incorrect. Hang on, just didn't mean to do that. Is slightly incorrect. It doesn't actually run under Gascoigne Way. It runs more just to the south of Gascoigne Way. In Culvert, goes under the sports field, the school playing field, goes under the fire station, comes out at the back of the Red Cross Hall, and then goes into Culvert again and runs underneath Ware Road itself, down towards the roundabout junction with Stanstead Road, then crosses under Tamworth Road, and there are a number of places through here where there are small culverts and there are trash screens on it, which require regular attention. And the photo down in the bottom right here is an example of one. So yeah, if you look at Ware Road looking back towards the town, this area I've ringed on the right hand side here may look like just a wall around someone's garden, but it's actually a head wall on the outlet of the culvert that runs under carries the Gulfs down under the footway on the north side of Ware Road. In terms of what we actually managed for the rivers, there's more than you'd think in Hertford. The map here is sort of fairly self-explanatory in what the structures are, but there's quite a significant amount of flood risk to Hertford if the watercourses aren't managed. And that's depicted fairly well here on the official flood map of Hertford. The dark blue is flood zone 3, is what we used to refer to as the 1 in 100 year flood envelope, which we now told we have to refer to as a 1% risk. That's roughly the same sort of severity of flood as was last seen in Hertford in March 1947. It's a rare event, but not considered to be that rare that we shouldn't actually be planning for it. And that's the standard test that's used for most property flood risk. The pale blue, flood zone 2, is a 1 in 1,000 year event, and that is a very, very major event. But it's interesting to see that there is an area of dark blue down here around the East Station and Tamworth Road, where the modelling predicts that there is a risk of flooding coming from the Gulfs at somewhere about the 1 in 100 year frequency. I'm not sure how many of the people who live in houses down there are aware of that, because I'm certainly aware of some of those houses where basements that would once have been coal cellars have been converted to residential use. And I would certainly myself be nervous about sleeping in a bedroom that was below ground level there in any time of extreme rainfall, because you could find yourself woken up in the middle of the night with water rising. In terms of the sort of maintenance works that I got involved in, we were essentially looking at 3 different types of maintenance in the broadest terms. Routine planned maintenance, emergency response, and routine debris clearance. And the 3 of them roughly equaled out in terms of value. Across my patch of around, as I say, 650 miles, I was responsible for a budget of towards the end of my time there, it had risen to somewhere about £600,000 a year, with 8 full-time guys doing the work and access to grab lorries and winch tractors and various bits and pieces. In terms of the emergency response type work, some of it was response during heavy rainfall to flooding, but an awful lot of it was the sort of stuff you see on your screen now. We used to deal with quite a lot of fallen trees, and these are some examples that I dealt with over the years in the Hertford area. So these are all examples which, coming back to what I said earlier, if the Environment Agency chose not to exercise its powers, then removal of these things would be the responsibility of the landowner in question. And the costs can be really quite substantial. For some of these trees ended up costing 4,000 or 5,000 upwards to get them out of the river. This one was quite challenging at the back of Bean River View, just from the size of it and the ability to get heavy plant anywhere near it to get it moved. Somewhere like the back of Riverside Garden Centre on the Lower Hatfield Road, we had a decent field to work in, and it made the whole process much easier. And that one at the bottom left in Waterford, for that we ended up moving a tracked excavator in to get it out because it was such an awkward one to deal with. Of the planned maintenance works, in Hertford, we didn't do a lot of bank trimming, although, and I hadn't got a decent picture to show what I mean by bank trimming. This picture in the top right is actually of the Stevenage Brook, but it shows the principle of one of the types of work that we used to do. We did some of that on the very small watercourses, but there was no need for that sort of work on the Lee or any of the bigger channels. People question when they see that the value of doing it, and ask, does grass and soft vegetation like that really hold water up to any great degree? And there's been a lot of research work done on that over the years. What they found was that the smaller the channel, the greater the effect. So in a small channel that's perhaps only 4 or 5 feet wide, then even 6 to 9 inches of grass growing on the banks can significantly slow the flow down in the channel and increase the flood risk. Once you get up to channels the size of the Lee and bigger, of sort of 3 or 4 yards wide, then grass has very little impact. But even on those channels, the impact, the advantage you do get from occasionally trimming banks like that is that you stop the progression of saplings and trees growing on the bank, and those definitely have a major impact in the longer term. More of an issue around Hertford is reed in the channels that don't flow particularly fast all of the time, and the Mulwood Mill Stream was a classic one for that. With keeping that under control, you either go in and cut it every year at try and time it at the right time of year so that the channel is in good condition to convey flows when the weather starts to deteriorate in the autumn. Or you leave it for a few years and then put a machine in there and try and take the roots out. And there isn't a lot to choose between the two options in terms of cost. Either spend a lot of money every 5 or 10 years or a little bit of money every year. But in terms of its environmental impact, it's probably better to do the annual cut rather than something as disruptive as raking a bucket through trying to take the roots of the reed out. Hertford does have some quite major flood relief structures, and people probably don't take much notice of them. They're just tucked out of the way. Most of Hertford's residents who walk across the footbridge at Hertford Basin here probably never think that much about the fact that the weir that they're walking next to is the main route by which flood flow leaves the Hertford town centre. It was enlarged and upgraded as part of the final part of the Lee Flood Relief Channel works in the 1970s. The March 1947 flood was the biggest flood that we've got on record in modern times down the Lee Valley. Caused major flooding to an awful lot of properties. It was caused by snow that laid around the catchment for a couple of weeks, and then a warm weather front came in and dropped warm rain on it, and the whole lot melted in one go. And the Lee Channel itself down at Wright House at Hoddesdon was considered to be unreachable and uncontrollable for 7 consecutive days, which is unusually long for the Lee Valley. The flooding through East London was so significant that it actually led to an adjournment debate in the House of Commons, and led to the passing of a specific act enabling the construction of the Lee Flood Relief Channel. They started in the 1950s down at Bow at the bottom end, and gradually worked their way up, and in about 1978 they finally made it to Hertford and built that weir. Not a lot to do to maintain a weir, really, as long as the boats don't obstruct it badly. There isn't too much that can go wrong with that. The two other ones on this page in Hertford are both on the Bean. There was a major flood on the Bean itself in 1968, which led to some severe flooding around Cowbridge and Bean Road and Morwood. And as a result of that, there was a flood improvement scheme done. The bypass to what was then Garrett's Mill was enlarged, and this weir in the bottom right here was built to actually pass the flows into the bypass channel that runs around the back of the old, what's now called Seal Mill. It's one of Hertford's major flood passage structures. But they needed to retain the water levels. The reason the weir's there is to retain the water levels running down past Millstream Close. But in order to get the necessary flood discharge at the end of Millstream Close, rather than relying on sluice gates that would have served the mill itself, they took the gates out and put this structure in, which there aren't many of them in the country. That's actually a flood risk siphon. It's the water level at this point drops by about 10 or 11 feet. And underneath that concrete hood, there is a weir structure. And normally it behaves just like a weir and the water stays where it is. But as flood flows increase, when the water reaches the top of the bottom of that walkway you can see there, the siphon effectively closes and it starts to actually suck water through it. And believe it or not, that siphon there shifts nearly as much water as the weir down here, despite being only about a quarter of the width. Quite an impressive structure to see working. Then once the water from all of these channels gets into the Lee navigation, passes down to Ware, and although this structure here is at Ware, it's effectively Hertford that it's defending, because this is the weir and siphon complex at Ware Lock that actually passes the water out of the Hertford impoundment down into the Ware town centre one. And again, they chose to use siphons here. This block in here is actually 3 siphons alongside each other, and each one of them passes more water than the whole of the weir that you can see. There are some quite substantial structures around Hertford that Hertford's flood risk relies upon. Another part of the job that I did was keeping an eye out for people doing works that could affect flood risk. And these are a few examples. If you want to do any works to a main river watercourse, then legally you have to obtain consent from the Environment Agency. It's much the same principle as getting planning permission. Just because you own a piece of ground, you can't go and build on it without getting approval from the local authority. And if you own a river, you can't necessarily go changing anything to do with that river without the approval from the body that looks after conveyance and flow through that watercourse. And these are examples of some issues that I came across in the Hertford area. Somebody along West Street decided that it would be nice to have a bit of a jetty at the back of their garden, and needed some advice and some information about what would be acceptable and what wouldn't. Most of that was taken out, although there was it was considered acceptable to provide timber revetment along that bank, just not sticking out into the channel quite like that. Up at Barrack Ford, we came across this one where someone had built quite a large deck out into the river, and anyone who knows Barrack Ford well will know that there are times when an awful lot of water goes down there, and that would have increased the problems at the ford itself and also at the A10 timber yard just a bit further upstream. This bottom left one's an interesting one. When Goldings Manor was developed, the developer decided that the river was untidy and wanted to tidy it all up in their view. They had a excavator and driver in and scraped all of the vegetation out of that channel without talking to anyone first. If they'd have spoken to the Environment Agency, then we certainly wouldn't have approved the sort of works that they did. And in doing so, they destabilised the embankment between that channel and the Mould Mill stream. It's not very obvious from this photo, but the water in the mill stream is almost 6 feet higher than the water in the river channel. And because they'd stripped all the vegetation away, the bank eroded and the mill stream dried out. So they ended up having to do remedial works to put that right. Having said that, I'm aware that the mill stream is again dry now, but that's for a rather different reason. Just above North Road, opposite the Goldings estate, there's a control structure which used to hold the water up at the bottom of Waterford Marsh, known locally as Horseshoe Falls Weir, and it has a sluice gate in it, which was the original control structure for the Mould Mill. That's where the flow down the mill stream would have been regulated from. That structure hasn't been maintained for a very, very long period of time, and there is some uncertainty as to who is actually liable for the operation and maintenance of that structure. The Environment Agency has chosen not to get involved in that particular issue, although I did get involved a few times with that site in my time there. I left the EA in 2014, so that's all happened since I left, but I'm very well aware of it. And I know that a number of people in the area are quite concerned about the state of the Mould Mill stream. And this final picture down the bottom here is just an example of what happens when consultation between public bodies doesn't go ahead. I had a call from a member of the public one day to say, were you aware that East Herts Council are doing work to the Bailey Bridge where you go into Hartham from Port Hill? And when I arrived on site, that's what I found. The Bailey Bridge was being shot blasted, sprayed, resprayed, and a new deck put in. And contractors had been in to enable them to do it and completely scaffolded out the river channel. We had some interesting conversations with East Herts Council over that one. It's not that we wouldn't have agreed to doing it, and as it happens, on that occasion, they got away with it. It wasn't justified to force them to take the scaffolding all out. Although if we'd felt that the flood risk was sufficiently imminent, then we could have done so. Going back a bit, yeah, there were some interesting conversations about why they hadn't consulted us first, and why contingency measures hadn't been put in place to maintain flow through there if we had had heavy rainfall while that was in. In terms of flooding in and around Hertford, one of the comments that I used to get all the time when I introduced myself to people, the job that I did and where I worked, was, well, we don't get flooding in this part of the world. I'm afraid we do. I've already mentioned the March 47 and the 1968 flood, but I've seen plenty of other floods in and around the Hertford area in the time I was there. None of them actually in Hertford affected too many properties, although in October 2000 we did finish up with I think there was over 600 properties flooded within my overall patch, just not many of them in the Hertford area. A little way from Hertford, this site on the bottom right here is just on the north side of Harlow, but that was an example of one of the sites that was a regular attendance from me, and yeah, it's an industrial estate that was built by the MOD in the Second World War when they didn't need anyone's permission to build anywhere they wanted to, and then when they'd finished with it at the end of wartime, they sold it on. And to the best of my knowledge, it's still an industrial estate, although there's been numerous applications to East Herts Council to convert it to housing. And you can see quite clearly from that photo, I'd be amazed if it ever gets permission for housing. Elsewhere in Hertford, some of the floods that I dealt with, I'd say about people saying we don't get flooding in Hertford. Or the bottom right there, the B158 coming into Horns Mill in October 2010, I can remember actually recording floods there to that same sort of degree as you can see in that photo 4 times in the space of 1 month. There wasn't much that we could do to actually manage it. When you get floods of that sort of magnitude, really all you can do is try and get the rivers into a reasonable state to convey those flows before the water starts falling. Once you get rain like that, on these sort of fast responding rivers, there isn't too much you can do. I did get involved after I'd left the Environment Agency in opposing the planning application that went in for the nursing and residential home at the back of the Terracewood Nursery at Hartingford Bury, which the applicants tried quite hard to get permission for. And my major concern about it was that their proposed access route was right next to these railway arches. They proposed to bring the access road down the side of the railway embankment, bridged across the River Lee, and then come out onto the B158 at this point here. Well, you can see from that photo why I considered that to be unreasonable. And even though I no longer worked for the EA, I personally objected to that and submitted my photos to support my objection. Whether that had any major part in the fact that it never got through, I have no idea, but I can only guess. So that's a sort of a quick summary of how I got into river management, a bit about what constitutes a river and the importance of what it's actually called and how it's described as to who has responsibility for maintaining it. Some idea of the background to the rivers in Hertford and the flood risk that they present to Hertford, and an idea of how it's managed. And I'm quite happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Ian. That's tremendous. A great tour de force around Hertford's rivers. I mean, one question at the back of my mind is, on the whole, with climate change, the suggestion is that this country is going to get more rain rather than less, also more wind, and that could just possibly be relevant. So we're presumably going to be at increasing risk in the years ahead in the sort of way that some other countries have already realised. What do you think about that?
Well, who's dealt with it, really?
It's interesting that I first came across the whole idea of climate change and climate predictions in about 1998-99. We had one of the lead researchers from the Met Office's climate change team down in Exeter come up to Hatfield and spend almost a whole day with us, talking to us and lecturing to us about the work that they were doing then around climate change. And even back then, the way they characterized it to us, they said, we're expecting for southern England, expecting average temperatures to rise. We're expecting to see less days in winter when we see snowfall and we see frost. We're expecting to see an increase in overall precipitation, but it will fall less consistently, and it will fall in a smaller number of big rainfall events. So what they were effectively saying is we were going to face more unpredictability of rainfall particularly in the summer months, but when it did rain heavily, the quantities would be greater. And that's been borne out fairly well by what we're already seeing from climate change. I've just come to the end of my first year doing an environmental science master's, and as you can quite imagine, climate change is one of the subjects that I'm particularly interested in on it. Done a lot of reading around the subject, and it looks as though, in terms of flood risk for southern England, what we consider currently to be the sort of flood that we might see once in a lifetime, by the end of this century, we will probably see that on average something like once every 10 years. So there is going to be an increase in flood risk, and that is being taken account of in planning decisions and in forward planning for emergency response and that sort of thing. Yes, there is definitely going to be an impact from the changing climate.